It was a cold, quiet night in the city. The streets were mostly empty. Streetlights flickered above as a black man in a dark suit drove slowly down the road. His name was James Daniels. He was calm, focused, and looked like he was heading home. After a long day, he didn't break any rules. His car was clean. He wasn't speeding. His seatbelt was on. Still, red and blue lights flashed behind him. A police car pulled him over. James sighed. Not in fear, but in disappointment. This wasn't the first time. Officer Brian Keller stepped out of the patrol car. His face was hard, full of attitude. He was known around the neighborhood for being rough, especially with black people. He walked up to James's window and knocked loudly. James rolled the window down halfway. Brian didn't greet him. He didn't ask for license or registration. He just said, "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" James looked at him calmly and replied, "Driving home." Brian's eyes narrowed. "You got smart answers, huh? Step out of the vehicle." James paused. "Have I done something wrong, officer?" That made Brian even angrier. "I said step out. Now." James slowly opened the door and stepped out. Without warning, Brian grabbed him by the arm and shoved him onto the hood of the car. He pushed his face down and handcuffed him. James didn't fight. He didn't shout. He just said one thing. "You'll regret this." Not in a loud or angry voice, just quiet, calm, like he already knew what was coming. Brian laughed. "You think you can threaten me? You're just another smart mouth." Other officers arrived. One of them, a younger man named Officer Reed, watched carefully. He looked confused. Brian," Reed whispered, "are you sure about this? He doesn't look like—" "I don't care what he looks like," Brian snapped. "They all act the same." Reed looked at James, who just stood there quietly. He didn't say a word. His suit was a little wrinkled now, and his hands were still cuffed. They took James to the police station and booked him for refusing orders and acting suspicious. But not a single real crime was written down. They had nothing on him. In the holding cell, James sat on the bench, straight-backed and silent. One officer said, "He hasn't even asked for a phone call." Another said, "He hasn't even told us his name." Hours passed. Then, just before sunrise, a man in a sharp gray suit walked into the station. He held papers in his hand. "I'm here for Mr. Daniels," the man said. Brian looked up. "Who?" The man gave a tired smile. "You'll know soon." The officer on duty checked the name. His eyes went wide. He looked at the paper again. "Wait, this can't be right," he whispered. He ran to the back to find the captain. Meanwhile, Brian still didn't understand. He walked back to the holding area. James looked up at him, still no fear, still no anger, just quiet eyes. Brian smirked. "Hope you enjoyed your little stay." James stood. He stepped forward until they were face to face. Then he leaned slightly and said, "Next time we meet, I won't be the one behind bars." Brian laughed. "Yeah, okay. Whatever that means." He walked away, shaking his head, but deep inside, something felt strange. Like maybe, just maybe, he had made a big mistake. James Daniels was out of the cell now. His lawyer had arrived, and the officers had no choice but to let him go. No charges, no explanation, just silence. But the damage was already done. His wrist still hurt from the handcuffs. His suit was wrinkled and dirty. But his face was calm. Too calm. Officer Brian didn't like it. He watched James leave the station without a word. No yelling, no threats. Just a quiet look that felt heavy. Brian turned to Officer Reed. "You see that? That's why you don't let them talk back." Reed didn't answer. He had been looking at James closely. Something about him seemed familiar. Not from the neighborhood, not from the streets. but from somewhere important. Later that morning, rumors started moving around the station. "Hey, you hear what happened last night? You talking about that guy Brian brought in?" "Yeah, I think he's somebody big." Brian rolled his eyes. "Big? Please. He's just good at pretending." But then something strange happened. The captain walked into the room, fast, angry, serious. "Brian, in my office, now." Brian stood up, a little confused. Inside the office, the captain closed the door behind him. "What did you do last night?" the captain asked. Brian shrugged. "I made a stop. Guy was acting shady. Didn't follow orders. I handled it." "Handled it?" the captain asked slowly. "You assaulted a man in a suit, a man with no record, a man who said nothing because he didn't need to." Brian frowned. "He didn't even tell me his name." The captain tossed a file onto the desk. Brian looked down and froze. On the file, it said, "Judge James Daniels, Federal Circuit Court." Brian's face went pale. "Wha? Judge?" the captain nodded. "You laid hands on a federal judge, Brian, a man you should have protected, not thrown into a cell." Brian tried to laugh it off. "He never said anything. I had no way of knowing." The captain cut him off. "That's the problem. You didn't ask. You just assumed, like you always do." Brian was silent now. His hands started to shake. The captain leaned forward. "He'll see you in court, not as a police officer, but as a defendant." Brian stepped back. "Wait, what are you saying?" "I'm saying you're facing charges: assault, abuse of power, false arrest." Brian's knees felt weak. "But that's not the worst part," the captain added. "Tomorrow morning, you'll stand in court." He paused, then gave a small smile. "And guess who's the judge on your case?" The news spread fast. By lunchtime, everyone in the station had heard it. Officer Brian Keller was in serious trouble. The man he arrested, the calm, quiet black man in the nice suit, was not just somebody. He was Judge James Daniels, a federal judge, powerful, respected, and now angry in a very quiet, controlled way. Inside the break room, officers whispered, "I still can't believe it. He arrested a federal judge? For nothing?" Man, Brian really messed up this time. Brian walked in, trying to act normal, but he felt it. The stares, the silence. He grabbed his coffee and sat down. One officer tried to talk to him. "You all right, man?" Brian forced a laugh. "Yeah, it's no big deal. He'll probably drop it. These guys never take it that far." But his laugh didn't sound real. Even he didn't believe what he was saying. Later that afternoon, Officer Reed sat at his desk. He pulled up his phone and searched. Judge James Daniels, dozens of results popped up. News articles, photos, videos of speeches. There he was, the same man from last night. But now he was wearing a black robe, standing at podiums, helping youth programs, talking about justice and equality. Reed's eyes widened. "This guy, he's the real deal," he whispered. Meanwhile, in the captain's office, a plan was already in motion. Court papers had been filed. The judge had agreed to take the case himself. Brian was being charged with assault, unlawful arrest, abuse of authority. Brian stood outside the office door trying to listen. His heart was beating fast. His palms were sweaty. The captain opened the door and looked at him. "Brian, get ready," he said. "You're going to court tomorrow." Brian looked confused. "Wait, tomorrow?" The captain nodded. "Yes, and you might want to wear a suit. You'll be standing in front of the same man you put in handcuffs." Brian's face dropped. He walked away slowly. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control. The next morning came fast. Officer Brian Keller stood outside the courthouse, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit. His hands were shaking. His mouth was dry. This time there was no badge, no power, no backup. Just him. and his mistake. He walked into the courtroom slowly. The room was quiet but packed. Reporters, lawyers, and other officers were sitting in the back, waiting. Brian looked around nervously. His lawyer whispered, "Stay calm. We don't even know which judge is hearing the case yet." Brian nodded, but his heart was racing. Then a voice spoke. "All rise." Everyone stood. Brian turned to face the bench, expecting to see some random judge. But then, his face dropped. Walking in through the side door, wearing a black robe, calm, serious, powerful. It was him, Judge James Daniels. Gasps filled the room. People looked at Brian, then at the judge, then back at Brian. His lawyer leaned over and whispered, "Oh my God?" Brian felt his knees go weak. He wanted to speak, to explain, to say something, but nothing came out. Judge Daniels sat down, looked over the file, then looked straight at Brian. He didn't shout. He didn't smile. He just said, "We will now begin the case of Officer Brian Keller, charged with assault and abuse of power." Brian opened his mouth. "Your Honor, Judge Daniels held up a hand. "I will remind the defendant that this is a court of law, not a street corner." Brian went silent. Everyone could feel the weight in the room. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. And now, the roles had changed. Flash moment. Emotional touch. Judge Daniels looked at Brian and said, "When you looked at me that night, you didn't see a man. You saw a problem, a threat, someone you could control. But now, do you see me?" Brian lowered his head. He had nothing to say. The courtroom stayed silent. The only sound was the judge's voice as he called for opening arguments. The trial had just begun, and Officer Brian Keller had never felt so small. As the courtroom settled, Judge Daniels took a moment. He looked at Officer Brian Keller, then down at the case file. But his mind drifted back to a time before the robe. Flashback begins. A young James Daniels walked down a street in his old neighborhood. He was just 14, books in one hand, head held high. Then came the police car. It pulled up beside him. Sirens off, just quiet pressure. "Where you going, kid?" the officer asked. "Home," James replied. "Looks like you're carrying something. Heavy. Just school books, sir." But the officer didn't believe him. James was pushed against a wall, searched, laughed at. No apology. No reason, just like that. He learned a lesson. Sometimes your skin speaks louder than your words. Years passed, James studied hard, got into college, then law school. He faced racism at every step, people doubting him, ignoring him, mistreating him. But every time someone pushed him down, he stood back up. And then, one day, he stood at a podium, wearing the black robe, sworn in as one of the youngest federal judges in the state. Reporters asked him how he felt. He smiled and said, "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for the young boy who was once told he'd never matter." Flashback ends. Back in the courtroom, Judge Daniels looked at Officer Keller again. This wasn't just about last night. This was about every night like it, about every person judged by how they looked, not who they were. Judge Daniels spoke softly. "I came from nothing. I was treated like a criminal before I ever became a man. But I rose. I didn't rise to punish people. I rose to remind them, justice wears no color." Brian looked at him, eyes wide, heart sinking. He was finally seeing the full picture. As the courtroom settled, Judge Daniels took a moment. He looked at Officer Brian Keller, then down at the case file. But his mind drifted back to a time before the robe. Flashback begins. A young James Daniels walked down a street in his old neighborhood. He was just 14. Books in one hand, head held high. Then came the police car. It pulled up beside him. Sirens off, just quiet pressure. "Where you going, kid?" the officer asked. "Home. James replied. "Looks like you're carrying something heavy." "Just school books, sir." But the officer didn't believe him. James was pushed against a wall, searched, laughed at, no apology, no reason, just like that. He learned a lesson. Sometimes your skin speaks louder than your words. Years passed, James studied hard, got into college, then law school. He faced racism at every step, people doubting him, ignoring him, mistreating him. But every time someone pushed him down, he stood back up. And then, one day, he stood at a podium, wearing the black robe, sworn in as one of the youngest federal judges in the state. Reporters asked him how he felt. He smiled and said, "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for the young boy who was once told he'd never matter." Flashback ends. Back in the courtroom, Judge Daniels looked at Officer Keller again. This wasn't just about last night. This was about every night like it, about every person judged by how they looked, not who they were. Judge Daniels spoke softly. "I came from nothing. I was treated like a criminal before I ever became a man. But I rose. I didn't rise to punish people. I rose to remind them, justice wears no color." Brian looked at him, eyes wide, heart sinking. He was finally seeing the full picture. The courtroom was full, not just of people, but of tension. The cameras were off, but the eyes were sharp. Everyone knew something big was happening. On one side, Officer Brian Keller, nervous, sweating, trying not to shake. On the other side, Judge James Daniels, calm, serious, and in full control. The prosecutor stood up first. He spoke clearly. "Your Honor, this case is about power. A man with a badge abused that power. He didn't ask questions. He didn't follow the law. He saw a black man in a nice car and made a choice." He turned toward Brian. "A wrong choice." Then came Brian's lawyer. He stood slowly. "My client didn't know the man was a judge. He was just doing his job. Maybe he made a mistake. But it wasn't personal." Judge Daniels raised an eyebrow. "Not personal?" he repeated. He looked at Brian. "You pushed me onto my own car. You handcuffed me. You locked me in a cell without cause. You didn't ask for my name. You didn't check my ID. You just assumed." Brian said nothing. The whole room was quiet. Then the judge asked a simple question. "If I had been white, wearing the same suit, driving the same car, would you have done the same thing?" Brian opened his mouth, stopped, looked down. He didn't need to answer. Everyone already knew. Then came the moment. Judge Daniels turned to the officers in the courtroom, the ones who had worked beside Brian. "To all of you in uniform," he said, "remember this. The badge is not for pride. It's for protection. And when you forget that, people suffer." Some officers nodded. Others looked uncomfortable. Officer Reed, sitting in the back, wiped his eyes. The trial continued. Witnesses spoke. Security footage was shown. Paperwork was read. It was clear. Brian had no case. He hadn't followed protocol. He hadn't filed a proper report. He had acted out of bias, not duty. And now, that truth was loud for the world to hear. The courtroom was silent. Everyone was waiting. The trial was over. The truth had been spoken. The evidence was clear. Now, it was time for the verdict. Judge James Daniels looked around the room. He saw young officers, old officers, reporters, students, mothers, fathers, and one man sitting in silence, Officer Brian Keller. The judge took a deep breath. He looked directly at Brian and said, "This court finds you guilty of assault, unlawful arrest, and abuse of authority." Gasps filled the room. Brian closed his eyes. His hands shook. But Judge Daniels wasn't finished. He continued, "You used your badge as a weapon, not a shield. You judged me not by my actions, but by my appearance. And now, justice speaks louder than assumptions. Then the judge paused. The room waited, wondering, would he go easy? Would he show mercy? Then came the surprise. Judge Daniels said, "You will lose your badge. You will complete 300 hours of community service in neighborhoods you fear, and you will attend racial bias training every month for 1 year. But more importantly," he stood up now, voice strong. "You will stand in front of young people and tell them what you did. You will tell them the truth, that judging someone by color can destroy a life, and nearly destroyed yours." Brian didn't speak. He couldn't. Tears welled up in his eyes, not from anger, but from shame. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Daniels walked out calmly. A young black boy ran up to him in the hallway and said, "Judge Daniels, you're my hero." The judge smiled softly and bent down. "No, son. I'm just a man who never gave up."